Good afternoon, and welcome to the 24th Annual Library of Congress National Book Festival, a place where books build us up. At this time, I would like to present our guests. We know that disinformation is dangerous, but now we know it is also a weapon of war. Annalee Newitz is a journalist and the author of several science fiction and nonfiction books, including the national bestseller, Four Lost Cities. Newitz writes for the New York Times and co-hosts the podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct. Their newest book is Stories Are Weapons, Psychological Warfare and the American Mind. Peter Pomerantsev is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University. He has written 2 books about Russian disinformation and propaganda. Nothing is true and everything is possible, and this is not propaganda. His newest title, How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler, is a biography of World War II propagandist Sefton Delmer, interspersed with Pomerantsev's own experience with the invasion of Ukraine. The session is moderated by Ross Valencina, the library's Chief Communications Officer. Enjoy the festival, and let's welcome them to our stage.
All right. On behalf of my colleagues at the Library of Congress, thank you for joining us today. It's definitely one of our biggest festivals. Thank you, Annalee and Peter. We have a lot to talk about, so we'll dive right into it. So the elephant in the room. When it comes to misinformation, is it better or worse from the last presidential election to this one?
So we were talking about this beforehand, and Peter said, do you want the tweet answer or the long answer?
Or the answer about Twitter.
Yeah, or the answer about Twitter. I'll say something relatively short about that. It's better in some ways because I think the public is more aware of the fact that there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation swirling online, swirling in the media, and we're kind of prepared for it. We're not necessarily prepared to recognize it. And 2 things that have changed since the 2020 election. One is that through the efforts of a number of politicians, including Jim Jordan, a lot of groups that were studying misinformation online, like the Stanford Internet Observatory, which I talk about in my book, have been disbanded, have been essentially sued out of existence. And so they aren't able to do the kind of really important work of tracking rumors as they start and as they spread online, rumors about where to vote or how to vote, just really simple stuff like that. The other thing that's changed is that we now have propaganda discourse about propaganda, and I will simply leave you with the point about Taylor Swift being a PSYOP. The fact that now PSYOPs themselves have become PSYOPs, which made it extremely interesting for me when this book came out and people were like, wait, how is Taylor Swift a PSYOP? And so I think that we're simultaneously more aware of psychological warfare, more aware of culture war, but also more confused. What do you think?
I think that it's always useful dividing this into a supply and demand issue. Is it easier to produce misinformation, which usually means accidentally produced lies, and disinformation, which means they're done on purpose? Is it easier since 2016? Overall, I'd say yes, because even though there is much more cognizance in society, some companies, have claimed to do more about this issue. There's also way more things that you can do. You now have AI and all these other technologies which make it way easier to proliferate lies. So before you'd have to have a troll farm with people sitting there typing stuff up. That's expensive and unwieldy. Now you just have one guy running an AI program shooting out that Taylor Swift is a PSYOP. So the technology's got more powerful. Meanwhile, in America, the research has been destroyed. And unlike in Europe, where there is the start of regulating this complicated space, in America, we've gone backwards. So that's the supply side. But even more worrying is the demand side, because my fascination, having spent a lot of time in authoritarian societies where I saw, especially in Russia in the early Putin years, propaganda being fed from the top, but also being demanded from the bottom, it seems to have got much stronger. I mean, I don't know how to interpret some of these statistics, but what is it? 30% of Americans think the last election was rigged, despite the evidence that it wasn't, despite Fox having to spend $1 billion in damages after they had alleged that there had been fraud to the company that ran the machines, the electoral machines. So the demand side has just increased wildly, and whatever happens in this election, I don't think it's going to go away.
What's scary is, most of this, as you write, Peter, dates back, or propaganda or misinformation actually dates back a long time ago. Like, you wrote that it dates back to the Trojan War. You wrote that it dates back pre-revolutionary America. So it makes us feel a little helpless, but we'll get to that a little bit. When it comes to misinformation, we've seen it could either be funny, like Taylor Swift, but most of the time it's either dangerous or deadly. From Hitler to the Lavender Scare, to Comet Pizza, to the Big Lie. There's some really scary kind of fallout coming from all of this. So let's peel this back a little bit, go back a little bit and see what lessons we can learn from history, or if there are lessons we can learn from history. Annalee, you wrote in pre-revolutionary America, there was a big lie or a big propaganda going on, and it centers around Benjamin Franklin and what was called the Indian War. Could you explain that very quickly to the audience, what that was?
Yeah, so Benjamin Franklin, one of the kind of founders of our nation, also was a producer of fake news. And during the Revolutionary War, he was trying to drum up support from the British public to ask their government to withdraw from the Revolutionary War, to get the British public to hate the war as much as the Americans did. And so he produced a fake newspaper with a very boring name that was full of letters that he had written himself that purported to be letters from soldiers that were fighting in the Revolutionary War. And in the process of doing that, he talked about how the Seneca had allied with the British, and that they were being asked to scalp women and children who they were killing, and send those scalps to Canada so they could be shipped all the way back to England to please the aristocracy there. All of this was made up. But it was lurid, it was gross. There were lots of descriptions of the scalps and the exact dimensions of the boxes that were used to send them back. It felt very real. And the story went viral 18th century style. It got reprinted in a ton of newspapers in England, and then it came back to the United States and got printed in a bunch of papers here on the East Coast. And even though the point of this propaganda, this fake news, was to make the British public think that England was engaging in war crimes and doing terrible things to women and children, and therefore they should get out of the war, the unintended, or perhaps the, not unintended, but the secondary effect of this story was also to demonize the Seneca and other indigenous groups that were fighting alongside both the English and the Americans and the French. And it really, I argue in my book, that it's kind of the beginning of what we think of as psychological operations and psychological war in the United States, because it is propaganda. And then after the Revolutionary War, the US government, the War Department, immediately is going to war with hundreds of tribes and nations in the country. And so the hatred that Franklin was kind of attempting to inflame by portraying the Seneca as these terrible war criminals simply continued throughout the 19th century. And so I trace the ways that we engage in psychological war to that long, bloody 19th century when the US was at war with tribes, both using weapons, kinetic weapons, but also using all kinds of psychological strategies to erase the history of indigenous people, taking kids away from their families and putting them in residential schools to remove their knowledge of their native languages and histories, and then all the way up through the present day where we're still dealing with these struggles.
It's one of those examples that something that the genesis was more than 200 years ago clearly carries on to today. As you mentioned, history is being erased, how Native Americans were treated. Why is something like that still happening? It could be like the average person could be asking. It's something that dates more than 250 years ago. Why has that not been completely?
Why haven't we fixed it? I mean, a lot of the strategies that the US government used in the 19th century turned out to be very effective. And so it became, you know, this, whenever the nation went to war, there was this twin effort to use violent force and use cultural coercion. And one of the things that the United States has always been good at, especially in the 20th century, is producing entertainment. We have an incredible entertainment industry. We have an incredible advertising and marketing industry. And once we had things like radio and movies and television, a lot of the things that were done piecemeal, like say with Ben Franklin's newspaper during the Indian Wars, we could do at mass scale. And this is something that Peter talks a lot about in his work too. And so I think that that strategy of erasing an enemy, trying to take away that foreign adversary's history, and using pop culture to do it, it's a winning combination. And part of what I trace in this book is how people who worked in writing science fiction, people who worked in advertising, got involved in psychological operations during World War I and World War II and brought those storytelling skills to bear. And so I think we're still trapped in that same cycle where our stories often bleed over into propaganda in the United States because we have this twin history of violence and culture production.
Peter, we can't talk about dangerous propaganda without talking about Hitler here. How did Hitler successfully spread misinformation from World War I all the way up to World War II?
So the power of Nazi propaganda is unique in its evil, maybe, but definitely not unique in its strategies. And it is about tapping into psychological needs, especially with Hitler. I mean, he was dealing with a society that after the First World War, people were in a state of confusion. They didn't know who they were. Social norms were being questioned. Gender norms were being questioned. A time of huge creative flux and excitement. Berlin in the sort of cabaret era was very, very inventive, but also a time when many Germans felt very insecure. So the first thing he did was give them a new common identity. You are the folk, the people. You know who you are. He gave them a language through which to feel superior to others. You are an Aryan, and all those people over there are illegal Jewish immigrants or something. But he was giving them a way to feel superior to others, to feel special. And perhaps most importantly, he was giving a way to legitimize and surface the most usually taboo negative emotions, anger, sadism. And we often wonder why these leaders who seem sort of incredibly narcissistic and incredibly hateful, why they're popular. Can't everybody see that Hitler or somebody else is narcissistic and hateful? And of course, that is why they're popular. They allow you to be that as well. You can identify your most negative feelings through them and bring them to the surface in a way that most polite society doesn't let you. So when you put those things together, plus, the sense of grievance and humiliation from the loss in the First World War, you have a very potent cocktail. But again, many people underestimated them. So the hero of my book, who observed Hitler's rise, when he first sees Hitler, he thinks he's ridiculous. He sees Hitler as part of one of these sort of absurd miracle men in Germany in the 1920s, who would be kind of essentially, they'd always be selling an ideology that Germany can be strong again, and then selling kind of pills that make you strong as well, just look at Alex Jones's shows, so similar. But the parallels are so striking. It's just like, Germany will be strong again, and here's my magic pills that will make you strong. And so he thinks Hitler is one of these charlatans at first, and he kind of laughs at him. And then he just sees him winning in parliamentary elections, and he goes, oh my God, this is really serious.
Speaking of that gentleman, the hero or the main character of your book is a gentleman named Sefton Delmer. Explain to the audience who this man is.
Sefton Delmer was really one of the most famous journalists of his day. He was fascinating. I think he had something in common with Annalee's main character as well, is that he was a man born in between cultures. His parents were British-Australian, but his father was a professor at Berlin University. So Sefton was born in Germany, grew up speaking better German than English, was bullied as an English kid at a German school in World War I. But then when he moves back to England at the age of 13 or 14, bullied for being too German. So a man very confused about his identity, but very, very aware that identities are created. You know, you can learn to act English. He learns to act English in the end. You can perform your nationality. And when he becomes a journalist, he goes back to Germany. And he's basically this, I don't know, will Americans know these references? You guys know who Tintin is, yeah? Yeah, of course. So he's kind of like Tintin. He does amazing investigative war reporting, yeah? But he's also a lot like Borat. You know Borat, yeah? So what he does is he pioneers a form of journalism where he dresses up in different personas in order to provoke people. So in the in the late 1920s, he goes to England, goes to little provincial English hotels, and acts like this boorish, very, very kind of like awkward German tourist, like, "Hallo, the English, what do you think about the war?" And trying to, as a social experiment, to see, have the British got over the war? Can they talk to a German? And it's this fascinating bit of sort of satire and sociology, and he writes this wonderful reports on this. I mean, just like you know, the whole Borat experiment is all about that as well. But he's also this very brave journalist. But as a master of disguise, he gets to kind of infiltrate the Nazis as the Nazis are rising. He essentially convinces them that he might be sympathetic to them. And he ends up sort of like, you know, acting as if he was an assistant to the head of the stormtroopers to infiltrate or to infiltrate a huge Nazi rally and write about it from inside. They like him so much that he accompanies Hitler on Hitler's famous air flights to different rallies. This is the 1920s. Quick aside, Hitler wasn't allowed on Twitter. No, Hitler wasn't allowed on the radio, you know, because he was seen as so dangerous. But he did really well in the elections in the 1920s because he was flying from rally to rally and inspiring you know, this growing fascist movement, while his rival, Hindenburg, was really old and doddery and could barely make it to do a public interview, let alone a public event. No parallels with the current, you know, American situation are there. And anyway, that's history too. But Delmer goes with Hitler, and he sees close up how it works, and that gives him just unparalleled insights. And when the war starts, he first, like everybody else, he wants to help in the war effort. He goes back to Britain, and he gets recruited by the German service of the BBC, who are, you know, they're a bit like the Washington Post today or something. They were like preaching to Germans about how democracy dies in darkness, how fascism is evil, how Hitler is a bad man, and how Germany should dream about its democratic future. And it's 1941. And Delmer is like, I think this is not going to work. What he would say is that the BBC, this is the German service, so it's broadcasting in German, yeah, to Germans. He'd say it's sort of stuck in its own echo chamber, preaching to the converted, and he decides to do something completely different.
You write that propaganda is the true remedy to loneliness. It was very effective during Hitler's time. It's sadly a reflection of what's still happening today. I'll start with you, Annalee. Why do you think it keeps on repeating? We kind of know the prime, I guess, suspects or the prime kind of audience of when people want to target someone who it could be, I don't want to say gullible, but who would eat up the misinformation. Why do you think it keeps on repeating?
I mean, it is an effective strategy. And you know, one of the main characters in my book is a fellow named Paul Leinbarger, who wrote the first guidebook to psychological warfare that was used by the US Army. And he wrote it right after World War II based on experiences that he'd had working in special operations in the Pacific Theater. And like Sefton Delmer, he had also grown up between worlds. He had a father who was a diplomat and a lawyer who worked with Sun Yat-sen. And Sun Yat-sen became Paul Leinbarger's godfather. And Paul Leinbarger, he was a Westerner, but he grew up in pre-communist China. He loved it. I read through his journals from when he was a kid. And he has this great journal where he's drawing pictures of Shanghai. He's like 10. And he writes, "Best city ever!" Like underlines and like multicolored pen and stuff. And he, throughout his adult life, as he studied Chinese history and learned more about warfare, he really mourned the loss of that place. And he hated the communists in a way that most Americans didn't. You know, he was coming at it from a very different place. It wasn't, you know, anti-Russian, it was anti-communist party in China. And he brought this sense of, you know, living between worlds to his job as a propagandist during World War II, and came up with a lot of different ideas for how to affect the Japanese public, how to get people to surrender. And one of the things that he really relies on in his work is the fact that he had a secret life. You'd think his secret life would be the fact that he's working with the intelligence agencies, but no, his secret life was that he was a science fiction writer. And under the name Cordwainer Smith, which some of you may recognize, he's a kind of a cult figure in the science fiction community, very popular in the 50s and 60s. He wrote these stories about uprisings on other planets, about oppressed groups of cyborg animal creatures who were ruled over by a ruthless government that looked kind of like the communist government in China, that was called the Instrumentality. And he uses these stories to think through what it is like to create propaganda that makes an adversary believe that there is a thriving resistance in their midst, and that this resistance could come at any time after the government, after people in power. And this idea that there's a hidden resistance really is an effective psyop. It's demoralizing if you are on the side of the ruling group among the adversaries. But if you disagree with the government, of course, it's a source of hope, right? Someone's telling you, hey, there's a resistance going on. And so he took his science fictional powers and he applied them to propaganda, and he advised his students and his colleagues to use the power of storytelling when they created their psychological products for aiming at adversaries. And he said at one point, you know, adversaries would much prefer the America of a Laurel and Hardy movie than the America of a square-jawed man teaching you how to farm. He really wanted propaganda to be fun. And after World War II, what we saw in the United States was a really interesting turn, and I think this gets to the point of why this keeps repeating, because until that point, propaganda had been something that the military understood as always aimed at a foreign adversary. So if you were in the military and you were developing psychological operations, which are, you know, messages intend to harm an enemy, it was always aimed at another nation. But during the Cold War and during you know, the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, all of those weapons were appropriated by US politicians and used against the American people. And suddenly, all of these tools that had been developed to undermine the morale of adversaries, to confuse adversaries, were being used against US citizens. And so that's really the dawn of culture war. And that's one of the things that I really got myself immersed in as I was working on this book, is how much the culture wars that we're immersed in now, where politicians are taking aim at marginalized groups like immigrants, like Black people, like trans people, LGBT people, how those all are picture-perfect reproductions of things that Leinbarger was writing about in his book on psychological warfare in the 1940s. And they're using three basic, I feel like I'm in a Monty Python routine, there's three basic weapons in the arsenal.
Or a TED Talk.
Yeah, or a TED Talk.
Very similar these days.
Yeah, exactly. That a PSYOP or a culture op, if you will, always will include violent threats. It will include overt lies, not just the little white lies, and some kind of scapegoating of a marginalized group. And when you look at the kind of political rhetoric that we're surrounded with now, it almost always includes at least two of those things, and especially the violent threats, which can mean anything from death threats to threats of imprisonment. So we've just seen this weapons transfer program continue on and gain speed. And so that's one of the things that is part of that repetition. You know, we've taken it from the military arena and brought it into the culture arena.
And Sefton Delmer did something almost similar. With the power of storytelling and stories, and that's what he used against Hitler to at least counteract Hitler's propaganda.
Well, Delmer ran, you know, he became head of special operations at the Political Warfare Executive. So he was running a whole empire of subversion. Dozens of radio stations in a multitude of languages across occupied Europe, a daily newspaper, leaflets, you know, a staff of hundreds. Famous novelists worked with him. Ian Fleming, the Bond author, kind of made it all possible. They had been old friends. Muriel Spark, the great Scottish novelist, was there. Most of the people who worked with him were Germans or exiles, so a lot of avant-garde artists, a lot of actors from the cabaret scene. And they were very important because essentially what Delmer did was create stations which pretended to be Nazi stations, but weren't, and would mix some of the nastiest bits of Nazi propaganda with content that subverted the Nazis as well. So the most famous example is the first radio station that he creates, which isn't even a radio station. To the person listening to it in Germany, it would have sounded like a kind of a coded message from a renegade, very angry senior Nazi officer, kind of like ranting to his, you know, to his band of unhappy soldiers about corruption among Nazi officials, about you know, how everybody was a secret communist from Goering down, about how they're spending, you know, all their stolen money on orgies, a lot of sex, a lot of pornography, while poor soldiers die on the front. Why aren't we hitting the British hard enough back? The Luftwaffe is full of spies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. An incredibly colorful language. And with this kind of like incredible, filthy anger. Delmer said that his aim was to cover Nazi officials with the same, and I'm trying to quote here, with the same kind of layer of filth and slime that the Nazis had covered the Jews. And the show was an amazing success in terms of engagement. There's a lot of people at the time in Germany saying it's the most popular station in Germany. I have no idea what that means. They must mean the most popular kind of underground station, because this was a shortwave pirate station. There's no way it was as popular as regular Nazi radio, but that's the feedback they get. We see it in diaries. The British at one point start doing little polls with POWs they capture, seeing how many listen to stuff. Like half of them are listening to these radios. So that's what he starts with. And the idea is to, you know, create a rift between Nazi officials and German soldiers, which is an old split. It's a classic vulnerability of the Nazis between the army and the party. That's what he starts with. I mean, you're going to have to read the book because this is a family-friendly Saturday audience, but like, the porn is quite spectacular. And it got Delmer into trouble because when some of the more prudish members of Churchill's government found out, they were scandalized that we would be using something so filthy to fight fascism. More importantly than that, it didn't take the Germans long to work out who it was, and they started writing, you know, articles in the Nazi press saying this is just a British operation. At which point Delmer kind of has to do two things. One is slightly tone down the porn, but he kind of realizes what anyone operating today knows is that like deception will only get you so far. You know, it might work in a very, very quick burst. You know, if you're planning a military operation, you know, armies often will create a deceptive maneuver to distract the enemy. The Trojan horse is a good example. But if you want to do this kind of long-term cultural change, which is what Delmer's really after, he wants to undermine the edifice of Nazi propaganda, you're not going to get away with that for very long. And then he starts kind of rethinking his strategy.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, one of the things that I think is so interesting about that story, from the point of view of Leinbarger, who's codifying this stuff, is that basically what Delmer is doing is creating the illusion that there is this resistance within Germany. And it kind of does erode confidence in the leadership. So it's an interesting strategy.
No. As you mentioned that about Leinbarger, I thought the same thing. He'd go further than that. I mean, there was very little resistance in Germany. But so he'd work with partisan groups a lot. He basically would sort of tell like Polish partisans who were working inside Germany, like, after you kill some Germans, can you make it look as if a German resistance group did it? And here's here's a fake message. Just give the sense that there's a resistance, because there isn't one really. I'm thinking these days, whenever you hear about Russian partisans, or Belarusian partisans blowing things up in Russia, I always wonder whether it's sort of Ukrainians trying to sort of like give the illusion that there's some resistance in Russia.
I mean, the idea is that if the illusion goes on long enough, people start joining the groups. That's the hope, right? But yeah, who knows?
Some of this old propaganda, as I mentioned earlier, is still seeping into today's problems, whether it's, let's go way beyond World War II, whether it's the Lavender Scare with Senator McCarthy, to the fallout after Sandy Hook. You mentioned Alex Jones and spreading the lies about the families there. To be honest, after reading both of your books, there was a feeling of helplessness a little bit that I felt like, what can we do? This is clearly keep on repeating. So how do we, let's say, for the average person, how do we distinguish fakery from facts? And is fact-checking enough? Because we demand that all the time, let's say from journalists. You do your fact-checking when they do their stuff, when somebody's feeding the public lies, but is that really enough? What else needs to be done?
Fact-checking is not enough, I'm afraid, but my heart goes out to all the fact-checkers who've helped me make sure my stuff is factual. So I'm part of the small community of fact-based writers. One of the things that...
Can we fact-check that?
Yeah, exactly. Of course, I have science fiction where I get to make stuff up, so I try to keep them segregated. So I have a kind of a balanced breakfast that I recommend for dealing with misinformation, propaganda. And the 3 ingredients are slow down, keep receipts, tell better stories. And I'll tell you very briefly what that means. Slowing down is taken from the research of a lot of different folks I talk to who work in online misinformation and who look at algorithmic shaping of news. And one of the main recommendations that has come out of a lot of that research has been, maybe what we need is to have our social media be slower. So instead of letting stories go viral where you click a thing and share it without even reading it, what if you had to wait an hour before sharing a story? What if you had to wait a day before posting something? What if you had just a little bit of friction between seeing something and sharing something? Because it's those shares that cause misinformation to explode and truly mislead the public. So there's slowing down with our media. There's also keeping receipts, and keeping receipts is just whenever there is a culture war going on, one of the main things that gets attacked is history. Recent history of what's going on right now, older history of how various groups have been treated over time in the United States and elsewhere. In order to do that, we need to protect libraries. That is why I'm so happy to be here.
We do want to mention, Annalee, you wrote a wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post earlier this week praising the role that libraries play. So.
Yeah, and libraries emerged in the course of writing this book. I found that libraries they're kind of the opposite of culture war. If you're thinking about the public sphere and how to describe the public sphere, a lot of people now feel like the public sphere is a war. It's a culture war, it's just people yelling at each other. The library offers a different view where history is maintained, where many points of view are maintained. And when you enter the space of the library, nobody throws books at your head or tries to make you read an advertisement before getting to the books. They just say, follow your curiosity. Go ahead and look at everything. You want to know about frogs? Here's everything we have about frogs. I have no political opinion about frogs, just learn about them. So that's keeping receipts. And the final thing, of course, and I think this is close to all of our hearts, we're here at a book festival, telling better stories, telling different stories. Because it's very easy for stories to become weapons, to become tools of trauma, to become vessels for predicting a darker future that makes us feel helpless, like there's nothing we can do. But we can also make stories into pathways to peace. We can tell stories about futures where we negotiate with each other, futures like Star Trek, where we try to be not colonizing other planets, even though actually on Star Trek they do a lot of colonizing. But the idea is that it's a way of reimagining who we are as a community. And I think one of the things that you do so well in your book, Peter, is to talk about how propaganda does appeal to us because we're lonely and because we want a way to feel connected to something. And telling a story about peace and negotiation and coming together and solving problems, that's also a way of calling on people's sense of community. So that's your job out there, is to tell better stories and tell different stories. So those are my recommendations.
You were mentioning the speed about social media out there. Like just a good example maybe, it was like on Thursday, that big rumor that went out that Beyonce was going to perform at the DNC, and that spread like fire. Is the government, on a more serious note on these kind of things, is the government or is the military better equipped in handling how fast and the speed that technology and information spread so quickly?
I don't know if either of those actors, we definitely don't want the military too involved. And the government, look, I would love to, when I see, let's not make this gendered, one of my in-laws, let's not make a mother-in-law joke out of it, post some nonsense on Facebook. I'd love to call Facebook HQ or government Facebook lies and say, my in-laws are posting nonsense on Facebook again about Beyonce. And they will go, bam, fact checked, I don't think that's what's going to happen. So, I mean, look, you've raised the specter there of the question of regulation. Which is, I don't know if you're tracking events in Europe. I mean, there is a sort of titanic collision coming between American tech companies, especially X and especially Elon Musk, and European regulators. And what are they clashing over? They're clashing over two ideas of freedom. For the Musks, and here I'm not putting words in their mouth, this is how I understand what they're saying. They're talking about freedom of speech and their freedom of speech and their freedom as entrepreneurs to do what the hell they like. The EU and British regulation is saying, but hold on, the public has the right to understand how it's being influenced. Freedom of speech is the right to receive information as well. We don't understand what your algorithm is doing. We don't understand why I don't understand. Why do I see one thing here and not another thing here online? Why is this bit of content being suppressed and this being put up there? Why am I constantly seeing Elon Musk's tweets? I'm going to call it by its old name. And when I don't follow them out. Like, what the hell is going on? So we're kind of surrounded by this weird influences with no understanding about how it works, let alone any kind of power to control what is now our public sphere. So these are two different ideas of freedom, both of which are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The freedom to express, but also the freedom to receive information. European and British regulation is based around the idea that you as a citizen have the right to understand who's influencing you, how, who's behind it, yeah? Is it Sefton Delmer or Defton Selmer or Leinberg? You should have the right to know that in a democracy, yeah? And actually, the information environment we're in now, there's no censorship in it in the way that Mr. Jordan says in Congress. There's a different type. We do not understand the black box of algorithms that influence us every day. That's a huge democratic deficit. But I completely agree. Regulation can help clear things up, make it a more even playing field, but you have to compete. You have to compete by design. You have to design other online spaces. We often use the metaphor of a city to talk about the online space. At the moment, it's a bit like the Blade Runner city. There's 2 or 3 huge companies that control everything, and you don't know who's real and who's not online or in Blade Runner. I don't know if everybody's seen Blade Runner, but whatever. And then there's the kind of the dark net, at the bottom, full full of filth and crime. And it should be like a normal city. It's normal that there is a Facebook or an X, but there should be what is the online equivalent of a park or a library or some sort of space where we meet to debate political ideas. It certainly should not be on X. X might be great for advertising campaigns for Coca-Cola. That's why it was created. It's really good at that. It's really bad for political debate. There should be a different space for that that's built for it. So there's designing things. And thirdly, I'm with you. At the end of the day, we're going to have to compete. You'll never regulate your way out of it. You'll never design your way out of it. We are in a race to who can engage audiences better. And the other side, who approach it with a mix of military thinking, a mix of really cynical advertising thinking, are totally effects-driven. They're totally audience-driven. And I think us on the side of democracy, we still hold on to myths which are nonsense. The myth of the marketplace of ideas. We'll put stuff out there, and the best stuff will miraculously float to the top through a theory of rational choice, which has been discredited by every social science.
And undermined by algorithms.
Exactly, and then yes, and then it's not as if it's not as if the marketplace is even.
Yep.
So we're going to have to learn to compete, and that means understanding people better than the other side. Which, look, every local journalist used to do that. Because every local journalist would go to, would hang out with his audience. And he'd know them. And that's why local journalism was so important. And now that's gone and been taken over by really something quite malign. That's where we're at. And I worry in America because I don't understand whose job that's going to be. In Europe, in Britain, we have a tradition of public journalism, which is all about that. Public journalism in Britain and in Europe is not about being boring. That seems to be what it means here. It's about, or educational. It's about creating a public. It's about engaging diverse audiences in a public square. That doesn't happen by accident. Somebody has to do that. And I've been 2 years in America now, and 2 years of people saying, hey, there's 30% of Americans who think the last election was rigged. And I'm like, what are you doing to reach them? It's like, the marketplace of ideas will sort it out. It's like, no, it really won't. So I'm sure America will get to it, but I'm still a foreigner here. But it's like, I'm actually not joking. It's very worrying. This is what I've seen in countries that do go authoritarian, where bits of society, allied with those in power, start identifying themselves by claiming a different reality. It's not that they believe it maybe as a sort of thought process, but like, we are the ones who think the last election was rigged. The way that Hitler would say, we were the ones who lost the war because we were stabbed in the back. That was his main myth, that the good German soldier had been stabbed in the back by socialists and Jews in Germany. So it's really worrying. Now, I did all that because I've got a new podcast coming out called Autocracy in America, starting September the 6th on The Atlantic, but that was by the by. Everything is a psyop.
While we're waiting for America to do something about it, like us average people, how do we program our heads to make sure that we're, again, reading, how do we distinguish or filter what's bad and good or what's true and not true? Sometimes this misinformation is happening in real time. You're just getting hit by trolls, you're hit by troll farms. You write about a good example of how this happens in real time and you can't distinguish if it's real or not is the DC blackout hashtag from several years ago. So how do we filter on an everyday level so we don't get caught up in something that's wrong?
I guess there's a couple of answers. There's the kind of deep thought philosophical answer, which is it's important to understand our national history a little bit, to understand why these stories, like the stories that you're describing, happen to capture people's imagination. Like, why are people so easily persuaded that the last election was rigged? Like, where does that come from? It doesn't come out of nowhere. There's a long history in the United States of people mistrusting elections and mistrusting certain groups of people to vote. And so one of the things that I really try to untangle in this book is the history of various strands in our culture war. And you've mentioned the Lavender Scare a couple of times. And that's a really interesting example because, so the Lavender Scare was kind of a I suppose you could say a subgenre of the House Un-American Activities work where LGBT government workers were targeted and brought in for hearings in front of McCarthy and were basically kicked out of their government jobs because it was believed that they were immoral, but also could be blackmailed. There were a lot of contradictory reasons for it, but people's lives were blown up. And that was during the 1950s that queer people were being targeted as un-American. But that stretched back even further into history, back to the 1930s, where the category of sex criminal was invented to describe why gay people shouldn't be allowed to be around children because allegedly they were behind all of these kidnappings. I'm not going to go into the whole criminal history of that. But the point is that this idea that LGBT people, trans people, might be somehow criminals that should be kept away from children and that should be kept out of government jobs like, say, school teacher jobs or librarian jobs, goes back almost 100 years in the United States. And so when you start seeing rhetoric about how trans people and their stories are polluting children's minds and they're turning kids trans and they're turning kids gay, again, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's groups of people who, as Peter was saying, are constituting themselves by buying into particular narratives about outgroups, about people who aren't like themselves, people who threaten them. And that becomes a way of identifying with each other. It's like, well, we're the people who don't like trans people. And that's how we know that we're a group. And this is a big part of Republican rhetoric right now, where there's just a lot of weird, I have to say weird rhetoric around the trans and how there's social contagion of transgender identity online. And I think that knowing that history helps to undermine it. And we have similar kinds of histories around the marginalization of Black people, the marginalization of Indigenous people and immigrants. Knowing that long history helps us to recognize when those stereotypes pop up again, because you keep seeing the same names being called, the same ways that people hail each other in these groups that are attacking marginalized communities. So I think knowing history is one thing. And then the other piece of it, to go back to this question about algorithms and not knowing how social media operates and understanding how information is being given to you, we need more content moderation. We need more teams at technology platforms who do what's called trust and safety. And these are groups of people who dedicate their lives to almost being librarians of social media posts, looking at the posts that are out there, examining to see if there are harmful rumors, if there's dangerous information, if there's illegal information, just trying to be the faces behind the decisions that are made at, say, a company like Facebook when content gets taken down or when content gets left up, actually putting people in those positions, because most of the major platforms, including, I'll just keep picking on Meta, which owns Facebook, most companies are now laying off their trust and safety teams. They're laying off their content moderators. And so nothing is being looked at. We just have these spaces where bots rule, where propaganda rules, and there's no one curating, no one's looking at it and keeping people safe in these public spaces. So we need both those things. We need history, but in the present, we need content moderation, we need trust and safety teams, we need human beings making decisions, not algorithms.
I know many of you probably have questions for Peter and Annalise, so we have 2 microphones here. Please keep your questions short, and please keep them questions. So while we're waiting for people to line up, and you mentioned libraries, and because the National Book Festival is hosted by the Library of Congress, I do want to read a quote from your op-ed celebrating libraries. We need to preserve our libraries and the books they hold, partly to figure out who we are and where we come from. But perhaps more pressingly, we need to preserve them as both a refuge from the culture wars and a template to rebuild a cultural life together when this war is over. Without them, we may have no way to teach our children to share ideas instead of battling each other forever. It's very wonderful.
Libraries are always a refuge for me because literally, so when I was around 9, 10, the age when you start going to school by yourself in London, but you're still small enough to be beaten up all the time. And there was a very dangerous road I had to cross from the area where my school was to where my home was. And there was a library on the corner, which was an old church converted. And they'd always see me coming, the kids who were there to beat me up and steal trainers. Stealing trainers was a big deal then. And I had to make it to the library, run up the stairs to the library, and there I was safe, because they couldn't get to me in the library. It was literally my refuge. And one time, one of them followed me in. And later I'd see the kid Alois from a kind of very disadvantaged, sort of white, working class, broken down family. But at that time I didn't really know him. And he just came in, and he was just amazed. You could see his face just sort of fell. And he was like, so many books. And there was this moment of awe. I now am probably like now completely making this up. And this, I think, curiosity and then complete panic. And he ran out of there like a vampire who'd seen the sunlight. So like, libraries were literally my refuge. So I'm down with libraries being a refuge.
I love that.
Thank you. All right, let's start with you.
Such a great lineup at National Book Festival. When I saw Annalee Nowitz on the schedule, I knew I had to come today. So how did you strategize the scope of your book when there's unfortunately so much propaganda and misinformation, even just in US history?
Well, part of the way I scaled down the scope was to focus just on the United States, because I knew that at least if I narrowed in on one country, I had only, one strand of multiple histories to weave together. And I wound up trying to spend, a good portion of the book talking about military psychological operations, and then the other part of the book is about culture war. And so I kind of tried to divide it between the two things. How did I pick which things I wanted to talk about? I mean, some of it was, I always wanted to talk about Wonder Woman. So there's a chapter about Wonder Woman and how she's a propaganda tool, for feminism and goodness. But I mean, a lot of it was just being guided by the material and history and following historical strands up through the present. So.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, all three of you, for an amazing discussion. These strategies are enduring. They haven't changed much over the years, except for technology and how they're delivered to us. Why are we still so bad at fighting it?
Peter, tell us.
We're bad at many things, no.
True.
But what usually, there is a pattern, I think, not a linear one. Whenever there's a new technology that gets introduced, whether it's the printing press in the 16th century, radio, the start of the 20th century, or social media now, there's a moment of incredible hope, and everyone thinks that this tool will deliver perpetual peace. When radio appears, it's a lot like the sort of early excitement around Facebook. There's this idea that people will hear each other across the world, and there will be no more wars, because we can communicate now. Mm-hmm. And very quickly, the opposite happens. The Hitlers, the Stalins, the various evils on social media realize, oh, hold on, there's actually an unregulated space where I can normalize the nastiest things within people. And that's what they do. And then it takes a little bit for the democratic forces to rebalance that. So with radio, it's the introduction of the BBC in the 1920s, which is a response to polarization and dictators dominating the medium. FDR here, using radio for good. And so it takes a bit of time. So I think there's that kind of drama plays out over and over, but there's this period of incredible turbulence before that equilibrium takes hold. And we're in that turbulence now, and hopefully we won't need a Second World War to come to our senses. Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
Was that optimistic?
I'm a public librarian, and and in light of everything that you've shared here today, how does that institution remain relevant moving forward with everything you talked about? Because we're all really tired.
Well, thank you for your work and your service. It is a very tough job right now, and one of the things that I talk about in my book, and that of course many other people have talked about, is how libraries are under attack, librarians specifically, teachers who work with books in schools, and there's no perfect answer. I mean, we do have to protect libraries. We do have to make people aware of how important libraries are. Libraries are community spaces, and they continue to be. And I think that part of what we need to do is make sure that funders are recognizing that libraries are a place for communities to gather. It's not just a place for finding books. Now they're places for having events like this. You have readings at libraries, you have meetings at libraries, people go to study at libraries, people go to use computers at libraries, find comic books at libraries. They're not out of touch. Like, I'm always weirded out when people say, like, libraries, like, why would you go there? And it's like, to get the latest manga? Like, you can get anything at the library. In San Francisco, where I live, there's a tool lending library. You can check tools out so that you can do gardening and you don't have to buy like an expensive lawnmower. You know, they're really a model for mutual aid, right? They're a model for care, for making tools available for free to your community. And so all I can say is that they are incredibly necessary. They're necessary for community consolidation. They're necessary for knowledge. And I really hope that going forward, we can make sure that our federal government and our state and local governments understand that. So write to your representatives.
I was about to say,
I want to keep the library open.
that clip should be played at every city council meeting that any public library needs for funding. So
Yeah.
thank you, Anna. Yes, sir.
Hi. Perhaps one more for Peter. I wondered, given your background and the topic of misinformation, if you would offer some thoughts on Putin and the Russian efforts at misinformation, how they've evolved since you were focusing on it earlier in your career, and is anything about what's going on surprising to you? Is it effective? Is it working domestically, internationally? What's the state of that situation?
So when I wrote my first book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, that was a decade ago, and it was describing what it was like living in Russia, but through the lens of propaganda in the first decade of the 20th century. And as I wrote the book, I found it echoing Christopher Isherwood's Diaries of Berlin, which you all know as the movie Cabaret. Actually, no, you're librarians, you know Isherwood, but most people know as the movie Cabaret. And as I wrote my book, I was like, oh, there's all these parallels with Isherwood. And I was like, no, it's not really going to go full fascist here. I mean, this is me leaning on Isherwood as I look for a literary model, and there's no way it'll be so bad. And then I wrote it, and it becomes that bad. And Russia is now, I don't want to get into the political science debate of what is a fascist state, but it's a fascist state. And the logic was the same, from this kind of exuberance and chaos and unresolved history of sadism and trauma. This cabaret that I described in Russia in the early 2000s, where all identities are up for grab, to this kind of one single fascistic identity that defines itself through the destruction of others and feeling superior to them. Right now, Ukraine, but after that, it'll be someone else. Punctuated by grievance and baseless victim narratives. So there does seem to be something canonical, that repeats over and over in these situations. So that's what Russia is now. In terms of their foreign propaganda, they were like the icebreaker. They had diplomats who suddenly broke the language of diplomacy and started essentially being trolls at the UN. Now everyone does it. They took the idea of foreign state media, as in like BBC or Voice of America, says, we're going to use it to do crazy conspiracies and hate speech. Now the Chinese and the Iranians are doing it. So they're kind of the icebreaker in the propaganda. They start using their troll farms internationally. Now, even medium-sized wannabe authoritarian states have a troll farm. It's like one of the things you do if you kind of want to act big on the global stage. So they've redefined the game, and now they're allying with Iran, China, Venezuela, and then really weirdly, countries within the EU, like Hungary, for these very tactical alliances in the propaganda space, with one essential aim: to make their own predilection towards mass murder normal, and to show the world that America's done. They're two things that unite all of them. In other things, they actually compete. So, yeah, I mean, they're getting their act together. I hope we are.
We'll squeeze in one more question before we wrap up here.
Thank you. Thank you, all three of you, for being here. It's been a great discussion to listen to. The tools and weapons that you talk about in your books are tools. They can be guided by intention. They can be used for good or for bad. What are some guidelines for us, normal people, that we can use as we tell stories of hope, which is a powerful weapon, and what can we do?
I mean, these tools, some of these tools can't really be used for good. Like a violent threat, pretty much never good. I mean, mass murder, pretty much never cool. Even if it's Klingons, we're friends with them now. So I think, part of it is the content of the story that you tell. It's not just like sort of the structure or how you disseminate it. So I think imagining stories, imagining messages that suggest that like negotiating and befriending your neighbors is like really awesome and adventurous and cool and fun. Like, making democracy cool, making like meetings seem like really exciting. Like, like if we can make mass murder sexy and fun, you know what? We could actually make like a large democratic debate fun. And I think that's a big part of it. I don't know, what do you think?
I think design, I mean, are you talking about tools, you mean psychological tools or design tools?
Either or.
No, I think design, I mean, you're talking about the psychology and the storytelling. I think design matters a lot. Mm-hmm. So the way our social media is designed is a choice. There's other designs out there. There's a great project in Taiwan called vTaiwan. It's kind of the anti-Twitter. So it's designed to find commonalities in people's arguments around very difficult issues, find the commonalities and find a common policy. So it's a policy-making tool. So it's designed to create a better conversation. So no, I think design is very important. If we're going to use the metaphor of a public square, how is that square designed? Who gets to stand on a pedestal? Who's been locked down in the gutter? What are the acoustics? I mean, I think there's a lot to do there, and I think there's probably a role for either philanthropy in the US or the public funding in Europe to make sure that's supported.
Unfortunately, I'm getting the wrap-up sign here. Thank you for everyone who's here today.